us, it's Michael E. Gerber, the wandering Jew, and Rabbi Levi Cunin, the practicing Jew, the observant Jew. And we're having our conversation again. And in fact, just prior to coming on with you, Rabbi Cunin and I were talking about family. And it just started a profound conversation. And I say a profound conversation. We started to speak about it. He started to speak about it. And I realized that we needed to speak about it with you. And so the key to it was trauma. And we were talking about family, and Levi started to speak about the trauma of the Jewish people. And Levi, I'd like you to continue with that so that we can have a conversation about that.
Thank you, Reb Michal. Good morning. Always good to see you. Baruch Hashem. So I was sharing with Reb Michal about responding to some of the previous conversations that we've had. And it occurred to me, you know, when we think about who we are as human beings, everyone goes through trauma. And trauma impacts us, and it impacts everyone. But some people go through a very, very deep trauma at a very, very young age. And that trauma leaves a very, very deep stain. And as I shared with you, in my hopes, when I talk with people, that's part of my job, where people share their secrets with me. I do my utmost to help them remove their stories from who they are, so they could live life not being dictated by the trauma. But I will have to say it's very, very difficult to do so. And what this results in, unfortunately, too often, is that you can have a couple that really have a spark of love with them, between them. But this trauma that one of the partners may have experienced at a young age is manifesting itself to the degree where the person really can't trust when the person says, I love you, that they mean it, or that's coming from their heart. And I'm thinking, imagine a husband and wife, one of them, say the wife went through a traumatic experience, and as a result of it, there's a certain level of deep, deep barrier that doesn't allow her to feel the love that her husband really has for her, and that her children really have for her.
What triggered, Levi, what triggered that conversation with you this morning, the conversation about trauma?
It's the trauma of the Jewish people.
And so when...
And I'm equating the experience that we have as individuals and the impact that trauma has on us to the trauma that the Jewish people have gone through. And if we were just to I said earlier, if we were just to take hours and hours, unlimited hours, we could cry on some of the horrific stories that our people have gone through. And as a result of that trauma, to some people, because of the trauma that they went through individually, it's stuck at a very deep level, creating a barrier for them to believe in the Yiddishkeit story, for them to trust it. The trauma of the Holocaust, I can't even imagine. The trauma of the Holocaust, the depth of its impact on a human psyche is beyond scope. I can't even imagine it. So when I think of the people who came to America and did not choose to practice Yiddishkeit, we must take into account the deep trauma that their families have gone through. And even though many of us stuck with it afterwards, despite the trauma, we all went through the trauma. My grandmother lost all of her siblings in the Holocaust. That put big question marks in my head as a child, growing up with faith and trust in Hashem. So I completely identify with the barrier that has been put forth. And I also feel that that's something that the Rebbe had brought to my attention, to be able to see the pain in that barrier. Because the truth is, and I wish I could do a better job at doing so. After all, that's what I'm supposed to be doing, giving and sharing the light of Hashem, the Torah, through the narrative of the Torah. I wish I had the words to be able to go through that barrier, because I'm not disagreeing with the trauma. I'm simply saying that there's something beyond the story of our trauma. I wish I had the words. I wish I had the song. I wish I had the tune to share something that I embrace despite the deep trauma that continues to impact me. I have not given up on the trauma of the Holocaust. I've not let go of it. I can't let go of it. But I've somehow or another been guided to be able to move beyond the story of our trauma one day at a time. So that's what awoke that within me.
And as you speak about that, Levi, I realized at the very beginning of this conversation that I've not experienced that trauma in my life. That's what comes up for me. I've not experienced that trauma in my life. But when I say I've not experienced that trauma in my life, in a very true way, it's that trauma of being a Jew has in some way been separated from me.
Or if I may say, you're maybe a product of it, a third generation product of the trauma. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
The people who decided to take a different route, they were the ones that had the trauma. Their grandchildren were completely oblivious to that journey because it wasn't part of their conversation, as you shared with me yesterday.
Yep. Yeah.
So we're all products of that trauma.
No, I understand. And I understand what you're saying, that we're all products of that trauma because it's all affected our lives in ways that we're not aware of. We've been separated from our grandparents, their parents, none of whom I've known, none of whom I've had a relationship with, none of whom spoke about Yiddishkeit with me. I didn't even know that word until you spoke it, the word Yiddishkeit. And here I am at 84, having been born in 1936, through the Holocaust, and don't remember having experienced the Holocaust at all. It confounds me. And when I was thinking about my uncles, my aunts, my cousins, etc., none of them that I know have been practicing Jews. And if any of them have been, in quotes, practicing Jews, the closest they've come to practicing Judaism was Reformed Judaism. And yet, interestingly, and I've said this, I'm sure, to you, I don't even recall, even in conversations with the Reformed rabbis that I've had conversations with, ever really having a Jewish conversation. My young sister, Marcia, who watches every one of these conversations, is really interested in the conversation. Who actually comments about you and your conversation more than me and my conversation. Her older brother. She speaks about how my mother was a committed Jewish woman, very active in synagogue, very active in Jewish organizations. And yet, that very same mother, when I think back to our lives together, I believe I've said this to you, I don't remember ever having a Jewish conversation. And I don't know whether that's simply that I'm completely forgetful of it, or that it just never happened. And then you ask, of course, her name of her mother and father was Gary, and we just talked about that. Obviously, it's a contraction of their Jewish name, which they got rid of. So obviously, to not be identified as Jews. But we've never talked about that either. Isn't that remarkable, Levi, that in one sense we were Jewish, and in another sense we weren't? That in fact, your Judaism, the Rebbe, Orthodox Judaism, is completely foreign to us and our family. And not just foreign, but negative. That in some way we didn't want to associate with serious Jews. It's very strange. It's just very strange as I'm speaking to you about it now. Just very strange.
Again, I think it goes back to the trauma, and the impact of it. Because I'm just putting it in words, but I'm not saying anything new. That's so much behind of what took place with the journey of the Jewish people, deciding when they came to America that finally they have an opportunity to melt in a melting pot and not be identified, in a way that they can be persecuted. There's a lot of trauma there. It's and you have to also, it's also important to understand that, unfortunately, if one did not come from the Hasidic movement in the last 300 years, it was much more likely for them to experience a trauma in a way that drove them away. It's a longer conversation, but in short, many of the religious people of your ancestors, the way they would tell their children about performing Torah was not answering their questions. So you have to do it. You're going to go to hell. There were many of those. So it was a very uninspired Judaism to begin with, and then top that with the persecution. The two together gave every reason for someone to say, I'm out. If someone is practicing a Judaism but has no relationship with Hashem, that's in a deep and a special and a joyous way. If it's all just rote and certitude without any inspiration involved, that's something that, thank God, Hasidism enlightened us with. But those that did not choose that path, many of them, when their kids went through trauma, growing up as a religious Jew, not really having a depth of understanding why they're doing things, not really getting answers to their questions, and coupled that with walking in the street, people calling them dirty Jew, throwing eggs at them, whatever, pogroms. I mean, it was horrible, right? So unfortunately, again, I think to me, it's totally understandable of why one would say, I'm out. I want to identify with myself in a way where I don't have to deal with that kind of baggage. If that was what was their Judaism, I could totally understand it, So it was, these are all written stories of, do you understand there was an active movement 200 years ago, a Jewish movement to rid the Jewish people of any religiosity. It was an active movement, a huge movement. It was. They were called the Enlightened Ones. You could read about them, but I see we're already at 24 minutes. But what I'm saying is that the trauma and the ways that it impacted us is when a person today questions why their parents or their grandparents decided not to make Judaism a centerpiece of their life, one has to take into consideration the journey from which those people come from, and who was it that influenced them, and how was it that they were influenced. And then we take pity on the fact that they went through such, and then we have to then turn to ourselves and say, okay, look, let's put that all aside now. You could be 84 years old, that's fine. But the bottom line is, this is your story. It's our story, and it's your story. And it's a crazy story, because it's not like like I shared with you in the past, from a scientific, statistical perspective, we should not exist right now. We really shouldn't. I'm just saying, if you just look from a natural perspective, like just to the equation, how many times everybody they threw us from country to country. They murdered us. They raped us. Come on, they did everything to rid the world of us. That's a fact. These are factual things. This is not a conspiracy. It's not fake news. And it's your story. And that's why I recall a great rabbi once said, if you want to see a real living miracle, look into the mirror. Because that's what we are. So anyway.
Levi.
Yes.
Where did all of that venomous loathing of the Jewish people come from?
You want to know the short answer, or you want to know the long answer?
That we're involved in a long answer because it's the conversation we're having. Okay,
so I just want to tell you something. One could give many, many different reasons for anti-Semitism, and there are many, many different theories that are out there. Okay, and the one clear one to me is the Torah tells us when Yaakov and Esav, Jacob and Esau, his brother, the twins, were in the womb, and Esau would become the father of many of the Anglo-Saxon nations, and that Yaakov would be the father of the Jewish people. And the Torah tells us that until the times of Mashiach, Esav is going to hate Yaakov. And and there'll be a progression of time where that will dissipate, and then in the times of Mashiach, that will cease to be. I know that that may not be an answer that when people listen to, so what the heck does that mean? But in short, where the Torah answer to it, and how I've come to, after all the different conversations that none of them really made sense to me, the Torah one is that there's forces out there, and there are certain people that are governed by certain forces, and those forces, we refer to them as forces of darkness, and our job is to illuminate that darkness. That's our job as a Jewish people. And up until that,
your answer is a spiritual answer, not a social answer.
I believe, after looking into all the social answers, although I preface that say you could look it up, not one of them really made rational sense to me. Not one of them. So that's why I had no choice in my own journey other than to go to the spiritual answer. Okay. I know that may not satiate what you're looking for.
Levi, thank you. Our time's up.
All right. Have a good day.
Our time's up. Have a lovely day, Levi.